I was debating someone on the internet the other day, and I came across this comment. Have you ever seen a country commit economic suicide like the US has over the past generation? The answer to this question is yes, I have. And that country is all of them. Every single country on this entire planet went through a golden age of prosperity from the mid-40s to the mid-70s and has been shit ever since. Chances are you've probably seen this graph 100 times by now. It's a graph of real wages in relation to productivity, and it tells the story of wages going up with productivity for 30 years, and then wages completely lagging productivity since the mid-70s. People usually blame this on Ronald Reagan or declining unions or income inequality or whatever the heck they want to. But here's the question. Have you ever seen a graph like this for another country? Take a look at this graph of productivity and wages for Australia. Or this one for Japan, or this one for France, or this one for Austria. There's hardly any difference. So it's pretty undeniable that wage growth has been bad since the mid-70s, especially compared to the previous 30-year period. But there's no evidence at all that it's particularly bad here in the US. In this video, I want to accomplish two goals. The first is prove to you that wage growth since the mid-70s has been bad on a global scale, regardless of whether or not a country saw income inequality go up or down. And two, explain to you how millions of people have been misled into thinking that wage stagnation is something that only happened in the US when nothing could be further from the truth. This is a chart from the INSEE, the French equivalent to the Census Bureau. And it literally translates in French to average annual growth for 5 years, the purchasing power of workers' wages. Here are two graphs I found across the internet of wages in France over the last 60 years. They tell the exact same story we see here in the US. 30 years of amazing wage growth in a time period they call le 30 glorieux six, French for the glorious 30, followed by 30 years of abysmal wage growth. I know what you're probably thinking. Income inequality hasn't gone up in France. In fact, it's gone down. So why have wages been stagnant? The answer is unemployment. This is a graph of unemployment in France since the late 40s. France went through a 30-year period of just 3% unemployment. That ended in the mid-70s, and unemployment has been around 9% ever since. In the US, there's hardly a difference between unemployment in the 50s and 60s and today, but there is with income inequality. This is the fallacy that so many people commit. They look at our country and they say, hey, when income inequality was low in the 50s and 60s, wage growth was great. So it must just prove that growing income inequality is causing wages to stagnate. But other countries experience the exact same thing, but for different reasons. France has actually seen income inequality go down. The column on the left says relative wages of managerial staff to workers. While workers have seen abysmal wage growth over the last 30 years, managerial staff and supervisors have actually seen their wages go down. France, though, is one of a zillion countries. This graph, written in Dutch, says annual incomes adjusted for inflation. Yep, incomes have not gone up that much since 1980 in the Netherlands. This is a working paper titled Real Wages in Italy from 1970 to the year 2000. It tells the same story as every other country. Real wages have hardly gone up at all in Italy since 1980, and net wages haven't gone up at all. Real wages in Germany, numerous years of decline. Germany is a tricky country because Germany used to be split into two countries, West Germany and East. East German wages have gone up since reunification, but West Germans are getting paid less than they were in the early 1990s. This graph translates to the wage illusion and says that monthly wages in Germany are 30 euros a month lower in 2012 than they were in 1991. This graph translates from German into real wage development in Austria. In 1976, the average Austrian got paid about 19,000 euros. 36 years later, in 2012, that was 22,000 euros. 15% growth over 36 years. This is real wages in Greece from 1962 to 1998. Pretty obvious. Wages have been stagnant in Greece since the mid-80s. This only covers the last decade, but once again it's wage stagnation in Spain. This graph is unit labor costs in Spain, and this graph is of the minimum wage in Spain since 1980. I can't find any graphs of total wage growth in Spain, but it seems to be like it's been bad, just like it has been in any other country. And finally, this is the Statistical Handbook of Switzerland 2012, written in French. On page 13, it has this: the development of real wages in Switzerland, with 1939 being indexed to 100. Look at the score for 1980, 254. That means that real wages in Switzerland were 154% higher in 1980 than they were in 1939. And yet, the score for 2008 was 290, meaning wages only went up 14% over the next 28 years. I went to Statistics Switzerland, looked up this real wage chart data, and put it into a file you can see here. Real wages have collapsed in Switzerland just like they have in the Netherlands and in France and in all the other countries around them. And then finally, I found this graph for real wage growth in the EU as a whole from 1960 until 2010. Wages went up 4% up until the mid-70s, crashed, and have gone up less than 1% a year ever since. Going outside of the euro area doesn't yield better results. This paper is titled, "Why Have Real Wages Lagged Labor Productivity in Canada?" And it says that for full-time year-round workers in Canada, their annual wages only increased $53 from 1980 until 2005. This graph of hourly earnings in Canada tells us the whole story. And this graph of annual earnings also tells a similar story of abysmal wage growth. Then we have another source, the rise of the Canadian 1%. And it says from 1946 to 1976, real wages in Canada went up 150%, but only went up 10% from 1977 until the year 2000. This is a graph of real wages in New Zealand from 1982 to 2004. It says the median only went up 6% in this time period. And this is a graph of hourly earnings in New Zealand. This is a graph of average weekly earnings in Australia. At first it looks good, but remember what it looked like compared to productivity. Also, this paragraph says that wages declined after 1984 and then slowly grew in the mid-90s, but didn't grow at all in the time period of 1984 to 2003. And I've already shown you this graph of wage growth in Japan, saying that workers are getting paid about 10% less than they were in 1996. Given that wage growth has been bad since the mid-70s in all the industrialized countries, you may think that globalization is the cause. Maybe it's because all of our jobs are being shipped overseas. But here's the stunning part. It's even worse in poor countries. This is a graph of real wages in Mexico. When I first saw this, I said, this can't be right. Are you saying the average Mexican gets paid 2/3 less than they did in 1980? And yet, the answer is yes! It may seem crazy, but it's not just Mexico. Look at the real wages of people in Peru and Nicaragua. They're also getting paid way less than they were in 1980. And look at this graph of real wages in Venezuela. And look at this graph of real wages in Argentina. People in Latin American countries are making half of what they were in the mid-70s. And in countries like Brazil, there hasn't been any GDP per capita growth since the mid-70s. Why real wage growth has been so bad since the mid-70s on a global scale is something I'll talk about in another video. But here's what I want to talk about right now. Why do millions of people think that only the U.S. has seen bad wage growth when nothing could be further from the truth? Well, the big reason has to do with correlation causation fallacies. We're constantly told, Ronald Reagan did this. Oh, Ronald Reagan broke apart the unions, and Ronald Reagan did trickle-down economics, and Margaret Thatcher this and Margaret Thatcher that, and Ronald Reagan and all this other stuff. Well, if you believe that Ronald Reagan is the cause of our stagnation, you would have to believe that it was unique to us, because if every country went through this thing, then it would just be a correlation-causation fallacy that Ronald Reagan just happened to become president in a time of a global crisis. So that's reason number one, confirmation bias. But the other one has to do with the social problems that we're told are the result of income inequality. Constantly, liberals tell us that income inequality is destroying our society. It causes crime, it causes teenagers to get pregnant, it causes children to drop out of school early, and the U.S. is doing so badly in all of these social problems because of all the income inequality it has. But here's the deal. If you believe that income inequality causes wage stagnation, and wage stagnation causes kids to get pregnant as teenagers and drop out of school, then you would have to believe that in 1980, before all this stagnation began, the U.S. was this pinnacle society with no crime and none of these problems. The problem, though, is that it was. Look at all the statistics. The United States already had a high infant mortality rate in 1980. The United States had a high teenage pregnancy rate in 1980. The United States had a low life expectancy in 1980. The United States had much more crime in 1980 than it does today. And, surprisingly enough, the United States was already the fattest country in the world in 1980. This is what I'm talking about. We are constantly being lied to. We are told that in 1980 the U.S. was this crime-free, social problem-free utopia, and over the last 30 years, income inequality has caused teenagers to get pregnant and people to drop out of school and this and that and all these other things, and it's just destroyed this country. And people look at the infant mortality rates and they say, well, it's worse in the U.S. than it is in Sweden, so it must be true that Sweden has continued to see amazing wage growth, even though they have not. These types of correlation-causation fallacies are what I like to call impliers are liars. If these people wanted to make it seem like the U.S. is the only country to see wage stagnation, all they have to do is say, here's hourly earnings in the U.S. and here's hourly earnings in Canada. It's much better. Instead, they have to constantly cling to things that other countries do better and just insist that it's tied to wage growth. Like, no, I have no evidence that wage growth is better than other countries, but they have less teenage pregnancies, and teenage pregnancies are tied to wage growth. And so people end up thinking that a lot of the things that we were already doing badly in 1980 are somehow the result of 30 years of policies. It's completely ridiculous.